So yeah, my presentation is entitled Automate All the Things. And first I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Joshua Kaplan. I've been attending this meetup for a long time now. But yeah, I work for GMO Pepabo on an app called Minne, which is the biggest handmade marketplace in Japan. And it's an app for buying and selling handmade goods. And I've contributed to Danger Swift, and I'll talk a little about Danger in this presentation. And also, I like robots because they can do things for me. So that really ties in with my theme of automation. So first, why automate? Sometimes people are all in with automation, sometimes people are totally against it. There are lots of differing views, I think. But I think there are some fundamental rules of areas where are just guidelines, I guess, where it might be good to automate, and maybe some when it might not be as good to automate. I myself prefer to tend a little more toward automating rather than not. But of course, automation is very important when it can help you make fewer mistakes in what you're doing. And it can also give you increased development speed, make you more efficient, and it can also make your tasks more exciting. So going in more specifically about what areas to automate, specifically areas that take a lot of time is a very obvious one. And this, I think, people normally notice. But one area of automation that I think people don't tend to notice is when it takes time for multiple people. And it might not be a large amount of time, but if you have 5, 10, 20 people spending 5 minutes every day to do the same thing, then automating that can have a very high reward. Also, high-risk areas that might not really take that much time, like they might only take a minute, but if you get it wrong, your app is full of bugs or it crashes or something like that, is another good area to automate. And then finally, just things that are just prone to being forgotten, like making release notes for your app and making proper documentation and things like that. I'll just briefly explain some of the main tools for automating when developing iOS apps. I think most of you guys are probably already aware of the main ones, but obviously Fastlane is one of the biggest, because it can give you more consistent and standard, easier to use API over standard Xcode build tools and other command line tools by Apple. And yeah, I personally recommend using Fastlane as much as possible. Some people like making their own scripts around Apple's tools, but it really just depends on what kind of needs you have. Another common tool that I really like is called Danger. And there are versions of this Danger tool for Ruby, Swift, Kaplan, and JavaScript. And basically, it's kind of hard to explain, but it provides a programmable set of rules. So every time, for example, a pull request is raised, you can have certain checks that go on. So one of the most common use cases in iOS development is running SwiftWin, and then having inline comments on your pull request made by a robot, basically just a special GitHub account for Danger to show what areas are incorrect. And there are a bunch of other things you can do with Danger that I'll kind of get into. The next, people don't really consider it an automation tool a lot, I think, but SwiftWin is actually very powerful when you use custom rules. And you can define custom rules to check for a lot of things that might be specific to your company, and I'll get into a specific example later. And another is obviously scripting languages, Swift, Shell script, Ruby, Python, etc. And finally, an area that's really heating up, I think, is bots and GitHub apps. GitHub purchased or acquired Dependabot, which is a bot that helps you update your dependencies. It doesn't work for CocoaBot's Carthage or Swift Package Manager yet, but it might be useful for updating your Ruby gems if you use some Ruby-based development tools. And for GitHub apps, this is an area I've been looking into a lot just to help automate some common development tasks, like making reminders and showing when branches are stale, and just deleting merged branches and doing other convenient things. But the main thing I want to talk about today is continuous integration and how it's the ultimate automation tool. So first, just briefly to define continuous integration. It's a set of tools and practices to help make sure that your code is in a stable condition before you merge it into the master branch, and it makes sure your code is thoroughly tested and of high enough quality. And a keyword here is continuous, to make sure that you do this on a frequent basis, and a way to make sure that the code is high enough quality and make sure it's frequent enough is to automate this. And CI is often used as shorthand to refer to not just a set of practices, but also the tools or services you might use to do continuous integration, such as like Jenkins or Bitrise and services like that. So I'll just go into some of the things that you might do with CI. The most common use case that I think anyone who uses CI for is just running tests for each PR and then show fail or pass. Pretty self-explanatory, I think. But there are a lot of other things you can do, and just much deeper you can get. So another area I think is very convenient is using linters and other static analysis to make sure that your style is conformant to your standards. So one of the simplest things you can add to your CI workflow to add more checks is you can use Danger and SwiftLint together to make sure that your code is linted. And for example, if you have some kind of violation, it could show up like this. You shouldn't leave any to-dos in your code, for example. Another area is that because tools like Danger allow you to write like basically any valid Swift or Ruby code, you can do a lot of kind of original static analysis on your own and other convenient checks. So one thing that I have to deal with as the only English speaker on my team is that there are lots of like spelling mistakes, and they can affect the searchability of your code if you're searching for a function name, but the name of the words used in the function are not spelled right. It can be kind of a negative. So I try to generally correct spelling, but I don't want to be that guy who's always saying, you spelled this wrong, you spelled this wrong. That can become kind of a morale issue. So I wanted some way to automate it. And when I looked in Xcode, it had a menu option to check spelling, but it doesn't actually work in the current version of Xcode. So it's unfortunate. In the newest version of Xcode, I believe it does. I haven't tried it out yet. But so basically, I looked into what are some of the most popular open source like spell checking tools. And basically the one used in VS Code is called, what's it called? CSpell. And basically it just has a lot of common English words in its dictionary, and then you could add some specific ones that you might need for Swift or just kind of UI kit based ones. And you can use regular expressions to configure which words you don't want to be corrected. But basically I set it up so you can have a comment that shows which line it's in, and you can click the link right here, for example, and it can tell you, oh, the word dictionary is misspelled. So it saved me a lot of time, and it was just very easy to write with just like a few lines of Ruby code that basically run this this JavaScript command line application. Some other useful things I think that you can do with your CI are automating common PR tasks, like assigning reviewers. So it's good, I think, to make sure you get specific people assigned to a pull request, so then you make sure you can get reviews done earlier. And the way I automated this at my company was just to basically have a few lines in Danger to randomly pick the 2 people who are not the author to review the pull request. And this just uses the GitHub API to request a pull, request a review. Another common thing that I think is very, very useful that I think everyone should set up on their CI is posting the results. I think it's always a pain when you have to like open the logs and then dig through the logs to find out why the CI job failed. So I highly recommend using a tool to bring in, for example, showing this is the build time error, this is the warning that appeared. Well, it's not in this example, but this is the test that failed. So then you don't have to spend all that extra time going through your logs, which can be, really, really long and can take a while to load. So using a common danger plugin, you can just use settings like this and have it show up like this. And it saves a lot of time. Another useful area for CI is posting and keeping track of code coverage. Code coverage itself as a number is not like the be-all, end-all, most meaningful number, but I think it's just a basic kind of numerical way of looking at how much your code is covered by tests and how many tests you have. And it can really help push people to make sure that they write more tests. So, for example, with this danger plugin, one really effective aspect of this plugin, I think, is that when you have a very high percentage of code coverage, it shows a nice positive emoji, and when it's lower, it shows like this skull. So it just kind of encourages people in a subtle way to write more tests. And it shows per file basis, not every file, but only the files which were in your diff. So it can make it really easy to see, so you don't have to like dig through Xcode and stuff to find what the coverage is for that specific file. And just setting it up can be as simple as this. You just set your scheme, your workspace, what targets to include or exclude. Next, I think, is something that's not super commonly done in the iOS world on an automated basis, but I see very commonly in Go, for example, is checking for dead code. Unfortunately, with the state of Swift tooling these days, I don't think there's a way to check for dead Swift code without building. So I don't do it as part of each pull request. But basically, once a week, I have a checker that goes in and checks for dead Swift or Objective-C code, and basically sends out this Slack notification from the dead code god, I guess I named it, to tell everyone that there's a file that's not being used. So basically the way it works is for Objective-C, I use a Ruby gem called Fui. And for Swift, I use a tool called Periphery, which is free to use for most features, and then it costs money to use with some other features. But basically, I just have an automated CI job that runs once a week and scans Swift. First it builds for the Swift, and then it scans Swift and Objective-C to see if there's any unused classes, things like that. And here's my example of custom Swift rules, which I think are very, very useful. So the first one is, basically for custom Swift rules, first you just basically set up a regular expression, and then they can match what you want to find. So the first one has to deal with a bug we found, where particularly in the Japan market, it's a bug I think you have to watch out for. Users can set their iPhone to use the traditional Japanese calendar. So if you use calendar.current, it can show the wrong date format for what you're expecting for your design, and it can lead to a lot of different bugs. So it's sometimes good and useful to force a Gregorian calendar. So instead of trying to remember this, we just set it to an error in Swiftland, so your project doesn't build if you have that pattern, calendar.current. The other one, this is pretty self-explanatory. Just make sure that no one puts in an HTTP link without the HTTPS. And I think everyone's team has kind of custom rules that they could define that would be very useful. That wouldn't necessarily be part of the general Swift community, but they can come up with like a regular expression that can help you prevent bugs or just make sure that you keep in with certain standards. And it's a good way of automating certain standards that you might set. Okay, next I want to talk about some more advanced things. So the next area that I don't see too much done in CI systems for iOS too much is more runtime analysis and like kind of complex integration tests. This is an area that I myself have not introduced in my company yet, but I asked a lot of Apple engineers about during WWDC this year. So I think, so for Xcode you can run the thread sanitizer to detect for different issues that might appear with like deadlocks and asynchronicity. And currently, I mean, there are command line tools, and you can also run it just in the regular GUI and Xcode, but I'd really like to automate this and make it a warning. So if it appears, then you don't have to necessarily remember to run it on a regular basis. It just runs for each PR. But I talked to Apple engineers, and they say it does seem possible. It probably just involve parsing the standard output from the command line tool. And similar story for memory leaks. I mean, for both thread sanitizer and memory leaks, there are false positives, so I wouldn't make it an error that fails your build, but I think it can be very useful to detect a potential issue and make a warning on the pull request, and then you can look further in Xcode. And then finally is performance tests. This area is kind of difficult because depending on what you're testing exactly, you may want to do it on a physical iPhone. So that might involve more complex setup, but I think it can have some very large benefits in preventing performance digressions. Another area is dependency updates. I think this is a little more advanced, but there are a lot of examples out there in later years, I think. Updating your CocoaPods or your Carthage dependencies is something that I think should be automated just because it's tedious and it's actually fairly easy to automate. And if you just have a regular CI job that runs every day or every week or every month or something like that, then it can help you. It can help make sure you don't forget to update your dependencies. And my company, I mean, this is what it looks like. Basically, we have a script that kind of just runs like Carthage update, CocoaPods update, commits the changes, and then it builds it and runs the test to see if it can build and run the test. Obviously, if there are API changes, then the build fails, but they show up inline in pull request, so we can see what kind of differences there are. And finally, I think there's a very important area that I think everyone has heard of, but not necessarily everyone has done, is deployment, making sure you deploy your beta releases and your final releases using CI. And at my company, basically this is just an example of the Slack notification. But once a beta or a final build starts, we get a Slack notification so we know what's happening. And we get the status once it finishes. Automatically, you can tell some of the managers to update the release notes and do some other tasks, and also start testing. And for actually uploading it and doing all the tasks, I'd recommend just using Fastlane because it's kind of a set standard, and Apple's App Store Connect doesn't necessarily have all the APIs you need necessarily. Unfortunately, because App Store Connect doesn't have all the APIs you might need for updating, for uploading your app and doing all the tasks you would need, Fastlane relies on a headless browser a lot, which can break on occasion, but just keeping Fastlane updated to the latest version can do a lot to prevent that. And personally, I think a big advantage of doing your app deployment on CI is that you don't have to build locally. So then on your local machine, you can just continue developing. And you don't have to like switch to another folder or make another copy of your repository just to continue developing. Next is just about speed optimization, making sure your builds are fast, which I think is very important. The faster your CI builds get done, the faster your feedback loop is, and the faster you can get your pull requests reviewed and then merged. And one big aspect of that is caching. Unfortunately, Apple provides basically no tools for caching your builds, or they don't make it very easy. So with a lot of CI services, you can cache your derived data or the actual Xcode builds. But for your dependencies, it can be a different story. And then also caching derived data can be kind of inefficient when it's a very large file size, because then the amount of time it takes to upload can actually make your build slower. So one thing I did at my company was to cache our dependencies with Carthage. And basically the way we cached it is we used a tool called Roam, which if anyone builds a dependency and then runs Roam, it uploads it to an S3, to an AWS S3 account that we have set up. And it's saved there. And then anyone who wants to use a dependency and it's not on their machine, it's automatically downloaded. And the same for the CI. So the CI, will search S3 to see if that dependency is there, and if it's not, it will just download it. Or sorry, if it's not there, then it will build it and then it will upload it. Another alternative I considered is Git LFS, Git large file storage. But just because of limitations with our GitHub Enterprise account, we went with storing it in S3 instead. Another area is making sure is parallelization, and also making sure that the tasks on your CI are in the proper order. So I think it's a good idea generally to make sure that you have tasks like linting that don't rely on build, just to be earlier, because then you can get those results much faster, and it's that much faster in feedback loop. Another thing with parallelization is currently GitHub Apps is still in beta, I believe, but once it becomes full release, I think we'll be able to use it more and more for iOS development. Of course, we'll always have to build on macOS, I think, but running different static analysis, like linters and such, can be done in a separate, like GitHub app, for example, and then run at the same time. So then it could save you a few minutes. So yeah, in conclusion, just talking about CI overall reminded me of a term I've heard about with an interview. It's called liquid software. Continuous deployment and this kind of more futuristic version, I guess. Liquid software is a term that's being used more and more these days, and it's basically just making sure that you provide like constant releases, smaller and smaller, more consistent and smaller releases. And this can help to make sure that you don't have large branches that take a lot of time to merge, and that you don't have bigger, risky versions. And I think the more you automate and the more you strengthen your CI and make it better, the more liquid your software updates can become, and the faster you can move as a team. So I highly recommend looking into what automation practices you have now where you can improve, and maybe what areas you can automate in the future. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yep.
I'm curious to know what's the most exciting thing you did with Danger that helped you so much. I'm saying that.
Yeah.
But, sorry.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I've done a lot recently. So, for me personally, Because I was the guy pointing out the English spelling mistakes, and the spelling thing helped a lot. That's also, I think, that was a big cultural benefit too, because then, you know, I don't have to be that guy. If it's a robot, I mean, developers are very used to having robots getting angry at them. You know, Swift compiler most of all, I think. So it's just a lot easier in a team. And then also with style as well, like if you don't have to have people point that out, they're just robots, then it's just a lot easier. You can focus on more important things. More things that require expertise, like architecture, or you know, this area looks like it will be a bug or something. Yeah. Also, one really neat thing that I saw with Danger is using different linters and such, and then running like a formatter, and then using GitHub suggestions. You know, it's the new API where you can basically leave a comment with how one line of code should be, and then the person can accept it as a commit. And you can totally automate that with Danger, actually. The only limitation today with GitHub and that is that it has to be one line. I hope in the future they can do multiple lines or refactoring, so you can, you know, like rename it. But yeah, it's a very neat demo I saw.
Like Danger has basically access to the whole Git history, right? So like when you create a pull request on GitHub,
Yeah.
you can easily check the commit name or the request title, like everything, right?
Yeah. Danger can check more or less everything, and it's kind of a different story between Ruby and Swift version of Danger, but basically for any features or functionality that you're lacking, you can use, you have the PR like name, so you can use just some tool to access other GitHub APIs, or you can even write your own, because it can just run like any code in there. So there's a lot you can do.
About speed optimization.
Yeah.
Like you said, the faster we can build, the faster we can get like review or something.
Yeah.
So you have third-party dependency libraries. So whenever you update a version, then everything gets loaded to S3, or how does that work for the third-party?
Yeah. So yeah, actually, because we have that automated version checking, basically each time, instead of just running Carthage directly each time, we use Carthage in our case, but we run this like one-liner that checks, that uses this tool called roam to check if it exists on S3, and if it doesn't, then it just builds that, and then it uploads it. So actually, because that pull request is run in the CI, you theoretically never have to run Carthage build locally, which is very convenient.
So just out of curiosity, like what does it like? So every time you have to run on CI, then it have to download the binaries from the S3.
Yeah, so just download them each time.
So
Yeah.
that is faster than building it on CI.
Yeah, downloading from S3 has always been faster. So to give you more specific numbers, specifically Realm took a really long time to build. But let's see, it could take like over 10 minutes to build. Oh, so sorry, not to forget there. It's well made.
It's not his fault.
Yeah. Our servers are slow. Like putting all of our Carthage things together, it could take like 20 minutes to build the whole thing, and then downloading it instead took about 40 seconds. So it was a huge gain for us. And then S3 is so cheap that, you know, it costs us like less than $30 a month, less than 3,000 yen a month. So just download it all the time. So yeah, it's very efficient. I think for complexity, Git LFS can be very good. We don't have a lot of storage space on our GitHub Enterprise servers, what we're told. So yeah, we didn't use that. And Git LFS would basically just mean committing the build's binaries, and then it's keeping them there. So I mean, it's a lot simpler in some ways, but yeah.
Do you have any source code that is like kind of like library and internal tool which is being used in your project, but it is not in as a like third-party library that also takes time to build and every time you have to use it?
Yeah, so we have an internal basically one internal Carthage dependency, and it's just I'm not sure if this is the method everyone uses, but basically you have like, your auth token, and you have that in a card file. It's used like an environmental variable to get that, and I mean the tool we use to download it is, it can automatically pick that up and use it. Because naming of Carthage dependencies has to map with like the folder structure. You might have to, for the tool we use, there's kind of like this mapping, like config file that you can use, but it's very simple. It's like a YAML file where you just say actual name of dependency when built, and then like the name of the project, of the like URL or whatever. So yeah, it's very simple. Any other questions? Any questions about CI or automation in general? Yep.
Which automation server are you using? Jenkins or something?
We use Bitrise.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a very popular option in Japan. I'm not exactly sure why. I don't see many people using Circle CI. I think part of it has to do with people being intimidated by having to email them for the price in English. But yeah, for us, like, Bitrise is a good value. So, I mean, I think the number one thing for a CI server is just how quick of servers you get for the price. So, wherever you find the best deal, it's probably best. Okay, should we move on to the last presentation?
Sure. If there's no more questions.
Yeah, you can ask me afterwards. So,
Cool. All right, thanks a lot.